Welcome everybody. This is a Beam Exchange Grab the Mic webinar. My name is Mike Albu and I look after the Beam Exchange, a global platform for information, knowledge sharing and learning about market systems development. And I'm very pleased today to be introducing my colleague Mike Klassen and independent consultant Justin van Rhyn, who are going to be talking about the application of MSD to employment, and in particular a major study they did of scoping the landscape for projects that are doing this kind of work. Today, please introduce yourselves if you feel like it, no obligation, but please introduce yourselves if you want to through the chat box, which you'll find somewhere down the bottom. But also, if you have questions for the speakers now or at any time during the webinar, please put them in the Q&A box, which is also an icon down there somewhere on the bottom. The speakers are going to talk for about half an hour, and then we'll have a time, I hope, for a proper good old Q&A session with lots of to and fro and a bit less formality. So please, like I say, put your questions in the Q&A box, and when you're ready, we'll hopefully be able to get to all of them. That's probably enough from me. We've got 60 people in the room, still going up, and I'm very pleased to hand over, first of all, to my colleague, Mike Klassen.
I think I'm going to jump in first, Mike, but thank you for the introduction, and hi everybody. It's great to see lots of familiar and some less familiar faces on the call. So as Mike said, we're going to talk to you for about half an hour. We're going to introduce what the MSD4E landscape assessment is in part one. We're then going to take you through navigating the intervention library on the Beam Exchange where it's hosted. And then in part three, we're going to look at some use cases. And then in the time we have left, we'll jump into some Q&A. So part one, introducing what the landscape assessment is. Essentially, it's an initiative to try and map and profile MSD for employment interventions from around the world. And where it comes from is that applying MSD to employment is still quite a new and rapidly evolving area. And we've reached a point as a sector where there's a lot of demand for information on MSD4E in action and a lot of appetite to connect with others in the space. But at the same time, everybody's short of time and bandwidth, and that search and discovery function is sometimes difficult to juggle alongside your day job. So 3 implementers, Mercy Corps, Swisscontact and the ILO, commissioned the landscape assessment. And a particular shout out to Rachel Shah, Elsa Buckley and Dan Nippard in particular, who were very central to commissioning and overseeing the work. And so what Mike and I did was we looked at 53 intervention summaries of a couple of pages each. The work is now hosted on the Beam Exchange. Mike will take you through what the summaries look like, but they include an overview of the intervention and also contact information to project representatives in case you want to make contact. I want to say it was a group effort across the industry. I mean, so many people on this call and beyond contributed either through interviews, through helping to draft case studies. So it was a huge collective effort. The intervention library itself, it's searchable, it's tagged to make finding relevant information easier. And then alongside these intervention summaries, we pulled together a summary report that gives you the overview and the headline findings. And we've really only scratched the surface on its uses so far. And later on, we're going to talk through some ideas of where you might be able to take this. So I'll just spend a minute talking through some of the points on the methodology behind the study. So our unit of analysis was the intervention rather than the project. We wanted to make the exercise a bit more granular and allow lessons to be more easily transferred between related pieces of work. We focused outside of primary agriculture. We screened interventions based on their alignment with MSD principles. So it didn't need to be an officially MSD project, but it did need to look at supporting behavior change in market actors, sustainability, scale, and so on. And there were certain interventions that didn't quite pass that litmus test. But luckily, a lot that did. In terms of limitations, I think it's important to say this isn't a comprehensive review. We captured everything we could, but there are bound to be good examples missing, and there is an opportunity to feed in more examples, which we'll talk about later. Secondly, all the results were self-reported, and the usual caveats that come with that. And third, this wasn't an evaluation. We're not trying to say one intervention is better than another. It's more of a showcase of what's currently being done in MSD in the field. And then the idea is that people use the resource in ways that are most useful to them. So in the summary report, we pulled together a bit of aggregated data where we could. It's a very heterogeneous sample, so quite hard to make these generalizations. But I just want to hold up two examples here, which might be interesting. So concentrations in terms of donor. Within the sample, STC and CEDAR had the most intervention summaries. And then in terms of region, concentrations in Eastern Europe and Africa as well. We'll spend a little bit longer on this slide in terms of how we've tried to categorize interventions. And we've used the jobs triangle as the basis for this. If you're not familiar with it, it's a really useful tool. And the other point to make is that obviously some interventions will cut across different parts of this jobs triangle. So in terms of job creation, I think we're all familiar with this narrative that there aren't enough decent jobs in a lot of contexts, high levels of underemployment, high levels of working poverty. So interventions looking at job creation in the landscape assessment generally followed one of two models. Model one was job creation in specific sectors. So we had examples like Prospects 4 in Liberia, which was looking at micro-distribution models for consumer goods. Or we had TMS in Honduras, which is looking to develop the tourism sector there. And out of this type of job creation intervention, we were generally seeing formal and informal wage employment. And then model two is interventions addressing cross-cutting MSME constraints. So for example, there's a program called MSAW in Kenya, which looked at BDS, access to finance, and market linkages for SMEs. And the idea with this type of intervention is that it generates self-employment and informal wage work through small business growth. I think in general, on the job creation side, we are still quite early on in the evolution of some of these interventions. You know, MSD has been focused on incomes for such a long time. And I think as a product of where we are, there's still quite a wide range of definitions in terms of what we mean by job creation. And sometimes outcomes getting mixed up or conflated. So job creation, job supported, jobs matched, jobs sustained, sometimes income change creeping in as a proxy for job creation. And within that context, like for like comparison is quite hard. And it's also not 100% clear what good looks like. So in terms of the scale of outcomes that we think we might be able to reach, or the costs or the timeframes. The next category is around within the access dimension, and it's job matching. So some of the common models across the intervention sample, we saw a number of digital job matching platforms. So for example, in Kosovo is one of the longest running ones. It ran for over 10 years, looking to support private job matching platforms. And then we saw a few examples of public-private partnerships, for example, around labor sourcing for industrial parks, and then a variety of career guidance services. And in terms of scale of outreach, some of these platforms are reaching tens or hundreds of thousands of users. There was one example where the platform had a million young people using it. At the same time, we still have some gaps in the evidence around the quality and the longevity of the roles that are being accessed, around the additionality of these interventions. So were these services going to come to market anyway? And then around net benefits to both users and employers. So potential displacement effects, thinking about the potential impacts on business performance of being able to attract more suitable candidates. And then the other dimension, which is interesting, is I think we still got questions around the commercial viability for the most marginalized to access job matching, particularly these privately provided services in contexts where maybe people have limited access to smartphones, limited digital literacy, and maybe where employers are not so willing to pay to advertise lower wage work. So I think here we need more analysis of the business models in play. We need more ex post assessments to find out what happens after these interventions close. I'll pass it over to Mike to take us through the rest of the jobs triangle.
Yeah, thanks, Justin. So we're going to stick with access to work, but now we want to focus in on this group of interventions we've kind of broadly labeled skills development. So this was a significant number, I think 14 out of the 53 in the study that focused on skills. And really, with this study, we were trying to focus on the systemic-oriented subset of this much larger field. I mean, there's a whole body of work on skills development and TVET. This is much larger even than probably our whole field of MSD. But we were looking at those interventions in that space that kind of were explicitly applying MSD principles. Justin briefly touched on this litmus test and the methodology, and you can read more of it. But I think, we've got to keep in mind that there's a little slice of skills work that's trying to be systemic, and there's a much bigger body of practice. And in the long run, I think, important to think about how do we engage, how do we kind of influence it in that space. Now, what did we find? As you can see on the slide here, kind of divide between two quite different models. We've labeled them employer-led training and public TVET system reform. So employer-led training, this is, typically focused in on usually a specific sector or a couple of sectors or industries, and you're hooking into employers' own incentives to invest their resources in upskilling, sometimes their own staff or sometimes a kind of upskilling program. So as they hire people, they build the right skills to kind of match them to the job at hand. So a really good example of this that reached quite significant scale with sustainability is the Sudoku project in Bangladesh. It's focused on the ready-made garment industry, and they kind of developed the whole internal in-house training offer that ended up scaling, I think, to like over 200 different factories, so a range of different companies. And so this kind of approach, quite visible, quite tangible. You can see potentially incentives to move in the short term is an enormous contrast to the other model. So when we're talking about public TVET system reform, often this is not necessarily just one occupation. This is the whole sector of TVET in a country. And so as you can imagine, that's a slower process. It can be potentially less visible. But if you get the conditions right and the right change agents, the potential for scale and sustainability is probably even larger. A couple of good examples of that TVET system reform. One would be the Bridge project in Iraq, which is a closed project, and another would be Skills for Jobs, which is still running in Albania. And really, these are kind of multiple layered interventions to kind of change, how individual institutions are offering training, even their whole kind of management philosophy. And essentially, I'd say the broad pattern here is how do you move TVET from focused on just churning through students and issuing certificates to saying, how do we orient these institutions to the labor markets? They're paying attention to what happens to graduates. They're changing their curriculum. They're partnering with employers, et cetera, et cetera. So that gives you, I think, a bit of a flavor. I mean, there's quite a lot of work under this one branch of the triangle, if you will. And then I'll cover off the final employment outcome, which is around quality. So, heading into the study, I think we probably expected to see very little work under quality, to be honest. And I think what's really interesting is that 40% of all the interventions in the study have some kind of a job quality objective. Now, there's a wide range of, what do we mean by job quality? This could mean the stability of a job. It could mean worker health and safety. Sometimes it means increased income within an existing job. So you're not actually creating a new job, but if that worker's having a higher pay for similar work, then you could say that quality has increased. Could be skills oriented. It could be benefits like pension and social insurance. I think the thing that you realize when you kind of zoom in a bit closer is that it's only 6 interventions where that was the sole objective quality. So, often it's something in addition to we want to create more jobs and improve the quality. We want to create access to work. Well, what kind of work? Higher quality work. So, health and safety is probably the easiest to kind of picture and imagine. And the one example I wanted to give you was the Boneza project. This is an ILO project. It was actually quite short-lived in Rwanda, but in a very short period of time, they managed to find a really kind of interesting and unexpected entry point or leverage point. And so they were interested in the kind of working conditions for informal construction workers in Kigali. And typically you'd think, okay, especially as an ILO project, Ministry of Labor would be your obvious entry point, but they weren't seeing a lot of traction. And because they talked to lots of contractors, they realized actually there are a lot of inspections happening from a kind of Ministry of Housing, a kind of housing authority that's paying attention to the building work. And that actor was actually really open to adding kind of health and safety considerations. So by kind of pivoting, they found a partner. They were able to actually change the kind of the Housing Act. I'm probably not getting the terminology exactly right here, but ended up kind of changing the situation and creating a new regulation and a bit of enforcement mechanism to increase job quality across the sector. So, I mean, I think there's a lot more work to be done in kind of understanding like differences. I'm saying job quality, but if you listen to all the different nuances of even what that means, I think there's a big diversity there. And happy to say there's some good work being done on how do you measure job quality, and how do you bake that into your strategy. So there's quite a nice paper again from the ILO on that front. So I think I'll leave it at that in terms of the jobs triangle and pass it over to Justin just to conclude the landscape study itself.
Thanks, Mike. So we're going to wrap up part one. So I think in conclusion, this is an area with growing momentum. I think that the study's proven that there's a solid body of work out there, and maybe even more than that, there's a real hunger from donors and implementers to learn. I think it's also a topic that's becoming more prominent within donor and implementers portfolios. We saw examples of portfolios being reorganized to avoid get around this syndrome where employment was sometimes falling between the cracks. So between the cracks of economic growth on the one hand and workforce development on the other. What we're seeing now is formation of employment-focused working groups within organizations, even new departments forming to look specifically at employment. The other thing to say is that all the interventions we looked at were thinking about the behavior change and ownership of that change among system actors. And in many cases, we are seeing encouraging signs of sustainability. And the summaries have sections on those issues specifically. At the same time, this is an evolving space and quite a lot is still being figured out. So I talked about evidence gaps. So for example, financially sustainable models for reaching the most marginalized, or how to get to that next level of scale on job creation interventions. And there's a clear opportunity for more research, both on live projects and also in terms of ex post evaluations. And we think that the landscape assessment really helps to shine a light on where that research might focus in a way that's useful to the whole industry. The other thing is to say is it's still quite a diverse and heterogeneous space. So some pretty distinct camps on the best way to support employment, economic growth on the one hand, skills development on the other, youth empowerment. At the same time, different interpretations of key concepts. So I touched on all of these different views of what job creation is. And I think with fairly strong sort of ideological views and a range of interpretations, we risk potentially pulling our efforts in slightly different directions. So I think our challenge as a field is really to understand that the scale and nature of the employment problem means that these sort of piecemeal interventions are not going to cut it by themselves. What we need are joined up solutions that leverage the full range of everybody's capabilities. So we're going to jump into part two now. Mike's going to take us through the intervention library. So over to you, Mike.
Yeah, thanks. So, I mean, I think the way to think about this is that there's a lot of overlap between the landscape study and the intervention library. And essentially, the building blocks of the landscape study are these 53 interventions. And then what's in that presentation that Isabel linked to is a kind of an additional analysis. And we just gave you the 8 or 10 slide version of a 50 or 60 slide deck. What the intervention library is kind of direct access to the data, to the database, if you will. And why have we done that? Why have we put in the time and resources? I mean, at a purpose level, I think fundamentally, the goal here is to help people in this space, this wider kind of field of practice, find each other's work, and not just randomly stumble across stuff, but be able to look with an intentional way to find particular types of employment objectives, to, of course, read the summaries, but as many of you know from doing kind of knowledge management work in the space, you're never going to capture all the details. So like, a key part of these summaries is that you've got the contact person for this whoever was kind of involved in writing it there. Really encourage you to, if you read it, if you're curious, if you want to know more, get in touch with them. I think that's kind of essentially the kind of broader type of exchange we're hoping to facilitate. The content it is what it is. 53 of these summaries, they're 2 to 4 pages each. On some of them, there's additional resources. So sometimes, Justin talked about the EYE project that's recently closed. They're putting out some phenomenal case studies. So sometimes there's a 40-page case study giving you the full story. We've still got the summary because sometimes when we're busy, we want to kind of quickly skim and read and be able to see the key features. And the use case, well, I'm going to walk you through that in just a second. So you can use the filters to narrow down what you're looking for. So actually on that note, I'm going to take over the screen share, and I think, yeah, you've got the link in the chat if you want to have a look yourself as you go. But let me just show you kind of what it looks like. So I'm starting here on what we're calling the landing page. This just gives you a little bit of context. There's not a lot of information here. Essentially, if you've never heard of it before, this is your kind of one-page overview. What is this thing? Where did it come from? But the main thing I want to show you is what happens when you actually try and search the library. So if you click search the library, that takes you here. Those of you that have used the Beam Exchange a lot, this is looking pretty familiar. So it's the kind of same infrastructure as the resource library, but this is a kind of really a specialized place. And what's different all comes down to the search filters, which I'll show you in a minute. Okay, so here's the full 53. So if you want to just skim and get curious, you can look through the whole list. But I think we've built this so that you can look for particular things. Now, imagine you've just heard Justin's part of the presentation, you're really interested in job creation, and he talked about kind of these different modalities of job creation, these kind of patterns or models that we saw. And so if you were curious and you wanted to know, well, what does that look like in a particular sector? We'll start by filtering by job creation. So we see we've gone from 53 down to 22. And the main theme is, I think, another really helpful search filter. So he talked about these two models, MSME ecosystem support. We've got 5 there, or sector development. Now, say the sector development one, because kind of fits with your logic, with the project you want to design or that you're working on, and you want to know a bit better, well, what sectors are we talking about? So we add another filter, bringing our total search down to 11. And then lastly, if you keep coming down on the right-hand side, you could look by target group if you're really interested in rural versus urban or women or youth. Could be geographically. But because we're talking about sector development, let's look at what sectors we're talking about here. These are broad categories, but you still can see, okay, maybe it's manufacturing, maybe it's ICT business services, but let's say you've been considering some tourism interventions, and so that really catches your fancy. Now we're down to 2. And last thing I want to do is just show you when you actually select one, how to get to the good stuff, because it's a little bit hidden. So let's pick on the first one. This is tourism product development. This is almost a 10-year intervention, I think, from Swisscontact in Kosovo. So the text you're going to get here is pretty basic, just an overview of where this is coming from. The good stuff comes here if you click download as PDF. That's where you're actually going to get the kind of real intervention summary. This is an example where there's also a results chain. So if you wanted to click results chain, you can have a look. Whoa, that's a lot of detail. So mainly what you're probably wanting is this PDF. And I'll just quickly skim you through it. I'm not going to read it line by line, but what you get on each intervention summary of 53 is a paragraph giving you the whole intervention in a nutshell. You've got a table here, nuts and bolts, who implemented it, what sector is it, who is the target group, what were the years of operation, critically, who's that point of contact if you want to reach out. And then what we walk through, what were some of the key constraints, who did the intervention actually partner with? And this was a complex one, lots of different partners. What were those behavior changes for each type of partner? How sustainable? So what were some of the signs of sustainability? What were some of the key results? And then for some of them, you also get a kind of one key lesson that dives into the kind of tactics and the learning from implementation. So that's kind of, as far as I want to take you on actually walking through what it looks like to use it. I hope this webinar inspires you to, take a look around and have a peek. But for now, I think we're going to transition back over to Justin's slide deck. And we're going to end with part 3. And so part 3 is about use cases. And I think the way to think about use cases is that this is a combination of our hypothesis of how we think this could be useful, but there's also a bit of precedent here for what we've seen already just in building out this database, getting it up online. So I'll cover the first 2 and then hand it over to Justin after that. So let me cover the 2 on the top. So I want to start with training. What's the use case of a kind of database or a library like this for training? Well, I think where we're going to see the most use here is when a trainer, it could be an external consultant, it could be an in-house advisor and implementer, kind of really wants to upskill a particular group or team on MSD from employment specific concepts. And so, they might go through their normal training and think, what's different about employment and labor markets? I'm going to pull some stuff from the rough guide. But then I get to that point where I'm like, what makes a training really tick? It's the examples. And historically, I think it's been really hard to find employment specific examples outside of agriculture. Enter the interventions library. So you can search, you can pull through a particular, you can pull through one case, you can pull through a couple. Of course, you have to then do the work to bring that to life for a group. But I think it really helps accelerate that design and tweaking of training. And the example I want to point to here is some great work that colleagues Sonia Hofstetter at Swisscontact, I think she's on the webinar, and Rachel Shaw at Mercy Corps, they used an early version of this library to develop a particular exercise that initially was being used in the Springfield Bangkok training. This was a module on labor, and they really wanted to show how do you get participants to practically look at real examples and figure out what's the difference between job creation, access to work, and job quality. And so they pulled 10 or 12 examples, gave them to participants. And so it's already been used kind of at least in the early versions of that training. Now let me cover the next use case, and then I'll pass it back over to Justin. So moving from a training context to what we're calling kind of strategy, here the use case we're thinking about, and we believe that there's kind of good reason for this, is ongoing project teams. You're already in implementation. A lot of things have been set by the donor. You're kind of midstream. You've got a set of interventions on the go. And what you want is to stimulate a bit more thinking and reflection about, how well is this going? And how can we get inspired by external examples? And I think, again, how do I find an example that's similar enough to what I'm doing that I can learn from it? And I think part of getting to that is needing to be able to filter, whether it's by geography, that could be really important, probably target group, and definitely by employment objective. But I think what we can imagine here is like a quarterly review amongst the project team, one of the sector leads, or maybe it's the overall team leader, kind of pulls a couple of interesting examples, brings them in, asks the teams working on the real interventions to kind of compare and contrast and just have a conversation about that. And if they get inspired, they can reach out and have a further conversation. And when we first did the study, we facilitated a bit of matchmaking between a few projects, and just an email saying, hey, you're doing this in Kosovo, you're doing this in Ethiopia. They're actually quite similar. Hands off led to some one-to-one meetings, some really interesting conversations. So that's the kind of thing that we think could be really useful from a strategy point of view. Over to you, Justin, to take home the last two use cases.
Thanks, Mike. So on the evidence section there, we've heard about gaps in the evidence base as we've gone through this presentation, and you might have experienced that yourself as well in the course of your work. So we think that the library can be quite a useful jumping off point for research. So you might be a donor or an implementer with an established project with a research and learning budget, and hopefully this can shine a bit of a spotlight on the gaps that the industry is facing in terms of asking, what works in employment. We also think, we haven't seen this happen yet, but we would love it if somebody had done this or would consider it, is connecting with academic institutions interested in employment, labor market, economic growth related topics, and using some of these projects as case study material, or even something more quantitative than that. The other angle here is around results measurement and benchmarking. So we've touched on it a few times, lots of different approaches to measuring results, making it pretty hard to compare like for like in some situations. And we're not claiming to be offering up a solution to that, but at least by making some of the results and the indicators more transparent, at least projects can see what others are tracking and at least are aware that this is an issue that needs more attention. And then on the benchmarking, we think if you are designing a new project, it can be pretty useful to check in terms of what are other interventions achieving in terms of their results, what kind of timeframes are we seeing for different types of employment outcomes. And then lastly, on project design, so I think for donors and implementers designing new work, this hopefully gives a pretty good starting point in terms of what else is out there. And that applies in a general sense. So seeing what interventions have been tried, what seems to be working, what lessons are coming out, who might be good resources to speak to on other projects, just to pick their brains. There's also a specific sense there in terms of if you're designing a particular intervention in a particular project or a particular sector, this might actually have examples of what else is happening in that space. It could even go as far as helping identify market actor partners that have been good performers with other interventions. And then lastly, we don't want to shortcut the diagnostic process and note that every country is unique, but we do see some potential in testing successful models from one context to in a similar context. Potentially just saving a little bit of time, at least just giving some inspiration of what might be effective. So final slide, just want to wrap up the whole thing. Essentially what happens next and what can we as an industry do to drive this forward? So the first thing is, Mike and I are very keen to emphasize that the intervention library is a community resource. It's not owned by us. It's owned by all of you and hosted on the Beam Exchange. So if you're using the library and something is working well, isn't working well, or you have other feedback, please let us know. And at the same time, if you have interventions that you think might be good additions, or you're working on a project that is currently featured but needs to be updated, just get in touch. We'd love to keep this current. Number two, hopefully some of those example use cases resonated. Some are tested, some are untested, but please do try them out. Share the library with other people who are interested in this topic. And I think also share what you've been working on. I think there's such appetite within the sector for thinking on what works and what doesn't, and really good scope to influence the discussion. So I'd really encourage blogs, case studies, research, get it out there. There's a lot of appetite. And then finally, if you haven't already, then do consider signing up for the MSD4E Community of Practice. It's a chance to get together a few times a year with like-minded people to discuss some of the big themes in this space. It's picked up some fantastic momentum. So it's got over 250 members now. There've been a series of really interesting technical discussions. There's a newsletter that goes out. And in some respects, I feel like it's just getting started. So do jump on board with that. I think there's a lot more to come on that side. And kindly, Mike has volunteered to be the point person for all of the above. So if you've got anything to reach out about, his email is on screen. That's it from us. Thank you for listening. Thank you for joining, and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Justin and Mike. Brilliant. Lots of very appreciative comments in the chat regarding the library. It is a small technical feat, and we're very pleased with it. So before we go into the full Q&A, I just wanted to invite Catherine Walker to say a few words. Catherine Walker works for World University Service Canada, and she's going to talk about some of the use cases that you've used, I believe. Catherine.
Yeah, thanks so much, Mike. Is everyone able to hear? You're able to hear me okay, Mike?
Yeah, I can hear you great.
Perfect. Great. Thanks so much for the opportunity to share. So yeah, my name's Catherine Walker. So I'm a market systems advisor at WUSC, as Mike shared. And so one of the use cases that we've been exploring at WUSC recently, so working closely with Mike Klassen, we've been introducing at WUSC a series of clinics. And so right now we're running a clinic series that essentially is with projects across our market systems development for employment portfolio, which I'm responsible for supporting as part of my role. And so essentially what we've been doing is, so we have a series of 6 sessions that are kind of spread over a 3-4 month period, where we're bringing together, just as Mike and Justin were saying, we're bringing together projects across our market systems development for employment portfolio. At WUSC, we particularly have a lot of programs that are in the skills space, so looking at skills for development, but a lot of skills development, but a lot of those interventions also look at other areas of the jobs triangle that Justin and Mike were discussing. So also looking at elements of job creation and job quality. And essentially what we do is we bring these different diverse teams together. And in each of the 6 sessions, we have a different topic that's focused on a key thematic area that's relevant to our portfolio of projects. And we bring together these project teams, have the opportunity for projects to really share and learn from each other. And this intervention library has been super helpful for us because essentially what we do is we send out some guidance prior to each of the sessions. And that guidance includes some external examples, so links right into the intervention library of examples of other projects outside of WSC that are implementing similar types of interventions, similar models. And it's been really helpful just to be able to help our team really be able to think externally. So really to have examples from other organizations, specifically of interventions that might be similar to what we're doing, are relevant to the theme that we're discussing in that particular clinic series. And having that intervention library and the ability to be able to really kind of sort and use those filters that Mike was talking you through has made it really easy to kind of pull out relevant interventions that we can link the team into and discuss. It's also just been really helpful to have that as a quick summary that we're able to share with teams. So not having to kind of go and do that searching myself online and find interventions, have it really right there. And then also, as Mike was mentioning as well, really have the contact people for those organizations. So if our project teams are interested in connecting with those programs, learning more, then that's readily available for those teams. So it's been really helpful to us as a learning resource. We've also been using, in our first session of this clinic series, we talked about some of those themes, those wider themes that we're seeing within the MSD for Employment space. So the landscape study and kind of some of those big themes that were coming out were really helpful for that particular session. And then, as I say, it's been really helpful to have those particular interventions as we're drilling into different intervention areas within the space. So yeah, I'll stop there, but it has been a really, really helpful, and would definitely encourage other organizations to look at how you can integrate this into training programs, into different types of sharing processes within your organizations. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Catherine. That's a really nice illustration of the applications. So I'm going to open things up now for Q&A. Just to remind you, please put your questions not in the chat, but in the Q&A box. There's a couple of questions, 3 there already. But before I go to those ones, I wanted to just pick up on some of the questions that we'd received earlier from people who registered. So it's quite a nice broad start or opening question from Haliform Abra in Mercy Corps. I'm not sure which of you would like to answer this, Mike, Justin, but he or she, sorry, I don't know, would like to know what really makes the application of MSD for labour markets different from other sectors or other applications. And what particular challenges do you face when applying MSD for employment?
We'll have a first crack at this, Mike, and then I'm sure you'll have other thoughts to throw in. Okay, good question. Thank you. I think one point to make is that a lot of MSD programming has been focused on income change over the years, and try to achieve that through growth and access in product and service markets. But quite often doesn't think so much in terms of linkages with the labour market. I think this sort of flips it on its head in a way and thinks about almost the labour market as the primary system and the entry point, and then economic sectors on the demand side, and then supporting functions and rules are relevant to the context as well. I think what that helps to do is I think job creation in some ways it's a slightly more multifaceted challenge than income change in some ways. What I mean by that is it's not enough for you know, one or a small number of big companies to be performing better. They need to be performing better in ways that drive large-scale job creation, whether that's companies or sectors. The other thing is that we need to make sure that we're integrating the demand side and the supply side of the labour market. So whereas I think historically MSD's probably focused more on the demand side, so through a sector lens, here we need to think about how the sector is growing in ways that also creates jobs and then links into the supply of suitable candidates, increases the skills of those candidates, etc. I think also it involves, it's sort of I mentioned in the presentation this need to pull in the same direction. I feel like income-focused MSD, I feel like there can be quite a lot of headway made through a single project and a single strategy. Whereas I feel like with this, you need to bring those different parts together, which often involves different skill sets, potentially different implementers. And to do that, I think we sometimes need to pull people out of their comfort zone. So going in with a single strategy, for example, I'm going to go in and develop skills, or I'm going to go in and try and get this part of the private sector to work better. On their own, probably not going to make a huge dent in the employment challenge. It probably needs more of a joined up sort of approach. Would be my first go at that one.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to add a ton more to that. I think we could have a much we did almost an entire plenary on this question at the DCD seminar. So it's an important question. It's not actually I don't think it's a simple answer. I've cheated a little bit by posting what I think is an excellent blog post from Rachel, essentially answering why is it any different. And if I was going to add one thing, I think it just comes down to the fact that I think labor markets are a lot more complex than we give them credit for. I think we use the word, but actually understanding that there's not one, but there's many different labor markets for different types of labor. And I mean, it's an entire specialized field of its own. I think, Justin wrote about this, you wrote about this in the rough guide. How do you access that expertise? How do you either upskill an existing team with it, or how do you insource or kind of hire, labor market experts to really understand what's going on, what's driving kind of hiring decisions on the employer side, and fundamentally that question of like where is the demand for labor and where is it coming from and what's constraining that. And I think, yeah, I mean, I think we're all learning how to do that well. And on the one hand, when we kind of use these adapted donuts tools, they help us because it feels familiar. But I think on the other hand, when you go case by case, there's really a lot of complexity there. I think I'll leave it at that because we got a lot of other good questions to tackle here.
Well, maybe this is actually a sort of just another way of looking at the same question, but Adam asked, to what extent is the job creation part of the triangle just normal MSD? Is that something you?
Yeah, I think it's definitely related. It's a fair question. I think if you were to look at the interventions doing that, there's loads of overlap. I think it's probably just a slightly more intentional approach to work in sectors and through partners that have potential for job creation rather than potential for income change. And I think there is a difference in terms of sector selection, for example. We need to be thinking about where jobs are not just going to be created now, but which direction is that heading in the future? We need to be thinking about where a target group are currently engaging in the labor market, where they might engage in the future in response to new demand. I think also it's really difficult. I think helping sectors to grow in ways that create lots of good jobs. To me, it's a different challenge to trying to improve incomes, which is where we've focused a lot of our attention. And I think that the levers of change are potentially a little bit different. I think we can't ignore the macro level drivers of growth that also creates good jobs. And I think we've tended to neglect that within MSD programming a little bit. So yeah, I think there are certainly overlaps. So I think it's probably a slightly different type of challenge in terms of the complexity, the levers that we need to pull, and some of the partnerships that we need to form.
Thank you, Justin. So there's a question from Edlira Mwedini about why the study that did not include non-formal vocational training, which in many countries is really important, especially in sort of dynamic labour markets. Do you recognise that?
Yeah, I'm happy to
question and
take
challenge?
to take this question. It's a fair question, Adira, and I think I wouldn't say it didn't include it. Probably what you're pointing out is that that single slide where we used to try and encompass the whole 53 didn't have like a an explicit other model for, you know, kind of non-formal. I think if there are definitely a couple of interventions in the 53 that speak to it. I can pop a few of them in the chat in a minute. So they are there. And then the challenge when we were doing that analysis of trying to aggregate up distinct different interventions into clusters, you know, sometimes you're going to leave something out. But there's certainly, I mean, I mentioned the Sudoku project in Bangladesh from the point of view of in-house training offers that the factories themselves were adopting, but they also had a whole other stream of interventions where they're trying to stimulate private training providers who are not, you know, this is not the formal public TVET sector. These could be quite small, and trying to stimulate their offers, both the quality and the quality assurance of that. And I know there's some work from Helvitas, perhaps some that you even worked on there that are in the study. So I'll dig a couple of them out and pop them in the chat. So they are there, you know, and it's just a case of making trade-offs when trying to summarize a large and heterogeneous set of work, which is kind of what this whole study was about.
Well, perhaps this is a similar question then, just quickly from Murad about relating to agriculture and why that wasn't targeted or focused on. Is it the same kind of answer essentially?
A little bit different, actually. Maybe I'll start, Justin, and if you want to chime in. So, you know, Justin gave a big shout out to our kind of thought partners in this. So it was really interesting. The study is co-funded by 3 implementers, which you don't see that often. Mercy Corps, ILO, and Swisscontact each contributed equally financially. And then Justin and I, plus the 3 organizations, really sat and hashed out a lot of different versions of the TORs. It's quite a kind of collaborative process. And fundamentally, the decision was made to focus this study outside of agriculture for the vast majority. Maybe there's 1 or 2 in there, but mainly they're there because there was some off-farm employment happening. And this is a little bit of pragmatism, just recognizing over the past 10, 15, 20 years, the enormous body of work that's gone into understanding and defining and measuring MSD approaches in agriculture specifically, and wanting this study, because it was limited resources, to focus on the kind of lesser known spaces. And, you know, I think some of the job creation is more familiar to Adam's point. But I think if you think about job quality, think about skills, think about job matching, you know, I don't think this was a kind of mainstream focus of the wider conversation. It's great to get to this point, having this webinar and seeing that. So it was a scoping decision to not focus. I mean, you can always argue that agriculture, you could consider what smallholder farmers are doing is a form of self-employment. We had that debate kind of conceptually, but then we made the pragmatic decision to say a lot has been done there, a lot less has been done over here. So let's focus our attention this way.
Thanks, Mike. And maybe this is also related from Lawrence. Do you look at how different projects defined job creation, and do you have any thoughts on that?
I think the short answer is not in any great depth for this particular study. I think the place where that comes out is across the results that we reported. You might get a sense of how they're thinking about their job creation work. But I'll give a sneak peek to some other work that's coming out through the ILO, looking specifically at the job creation question. And yeah, I think what's being discovered through that is, and I think confirmed by this study as well, is that there are a great range of interpretations currently in use. So I touched on it in the presentation. Sometimes we're conflating job sustained, job supported, jobs created. In other situations, we're considering types of job creation equivalent where they may not be in reality. So, for example, results frameworks considering formal creation of formal wage work in productive sectors equivalent to self-employment in the informal sector, and there are a few other dimensions like that where, as a field, we're not super aligned on what we mean when we say job creation. And I think, you know, there's a call to action there for everybody. We do need to align on this, because without that shared interpretation, you know, number one, we're not necessarily pulling in the same direction. number two, it can create some perverse incentives to follow the path of least resistance. If you're given an option between, in inverted commas, harder job creation and easier job creation, and you've got big targets to hit within a program lifespan, it puts a lot of pressure on a project, and can incentivize the easy route rather than the necessary route. So yes, it's a great question, and something I really hope we can get ourselves aligned around over the next few years.
That's been around for a long time, that need. There was a question from, I don't know if he's here, but Mark Winters also asked something along the same lines, really, which is, what is the state of practice in relation to measuring employment? But maybe let's not go into that now. Slightly different question from Orlando, about, to what extent do you see MSD4E working more or less with public sector institutions than regular MSD programs? Do you think this is opening the door to a different kind of engagement?
Yeah, I mean, I think across the different types of employment objectives, there's a lot of examples in this study that are partnering with the public sector, in quite interesting ways. I mean, I think obviously when we're talking about public TVET system reform, it's central. I mean, if you look at those interventions, the way that they're structuring interventions, it's not one public sector actor, it's multiple, right? How do you partner with the Ministry of Labor and the Ministry of Education? How do you partner at the national, regional, district government levels? There's a ton of nuanced learning that's happening there. Whether that's in Ethiopia or Cambodia, there's, I think, a lot of good stuff there. That's the kind of obvious side. I think within the job quality space, I didn't get as much time to dive into this. I gave one example from Rwanda, which was very much about finding the right public sector partner to trigger incentives that were going to impact construction firms, which then has a benefit for workers in terms of at least accessing some basic steel toe boots and safety helmets if they're going to be on a skyscraper. So I think there's going to be, more scope for work in that space as the focus on job quality kind of gets picked up. And, I think one of the conversations we had at the DCED seminar in Nairobi a few months ago, I heard a few people in kind of breakout discussions talking about, provocatively the challenge and the limits to MSD programming to work on job creation at large scale, in part because of the macro things that Justin was talking about, the need to partner with really different, foreign investors and things there. And that actually maybe some of the comparative advantage for at least what we know as kind of 4 or 5 year short time frame kind of constrained program structures, that actually there's enormous scope to create a much bigger impact in the job quality space. And I think, of course, there's a public sector dimension to that sometimes, but there's also interventions in that space that it's not just about top-down regulating change with all of its problems of implementation. There's also something to be said for finding incentives to get employers to invest in job quality, regardless of whether they're going to get penalized for not doing it. Yeah, anyway, I've gone off on a bit of an excited tangent there. Any other thoughts on the public sector side for you, Justin? I mean, I think, I'm not saying it's not important for job creation at all. In fact, maybe the type of public sector partner on kind of job creation might also be different. I don't know if you've got thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. Yeah, I think we did see. I mean, have a look across the interventions. There are examples of public sector engagements in all three parts of the jobs triangle. But one thing that plays around in my mind is that on an income-focused MSD project, you can quite often use a single company or a small group of companies as your scale agents for reaching hundreds of thousands of people. Job creation doesn't work in the same way. I mean, unless you can help create the next Amazon or something, individual companies can only employ so many people, and it's going to get very, the cost effectiveness of trying to do that company by company just doesn't make sense for most projects. So you ask who then is the scale agent for job creation, and I think quite often the answer does kind of drift back into the public sector. I mean, if we're talking about really big scale job creation, it probably does involve some sort of policy response. It probably does involve something around pulling in large scale investment. And yeah, that stuff's very hard to achieve without public sector involvement. So yeah, I would say if we want to look at job creation at a really big scale, then it's probably part of the answer.
Thank you. But look, I just wanted to pause for a second and mention something that's been highlighted by my colleague Pascal Fabing from LuxDev, which is that the community that you've been sharing all this about, the MSD4E community, is working closely. I wanted to point out is working closely with the DCD's MSD working group, and Pascal, who's one of the members of that working group, is really asking whether people in this webinar or colleagues would like to share any ideas or needs you have about how we should shape future initiatives in this community, because as I say, the DCD, the donor committee, would be interested to know what the demand is, if you like, for what's the next thing we should invest a little bit of resource in trying to build after this initiative. So if anyone's got any ideas, I mean, you could pop them in the chat now, or you can email Mike Klassen again with the email that we've already shared. But just to say, we'd be very interested to know what you think the next hot topic is that we could really invest in this space. We're close to the end of the hour that we have available for the webinar, and I want to just also mention, please give us feedback. Isabel's going to post a link to a quick feedback form. It'll take you 30 seconds just to let us know what you thought about this webinar. We'd really appreciate that. While you're doing that, interesting question from an anonymous attendee about the applications of AI in this space. Is this something that anyone's been thinking about? Is there any projects you came across been addressing it? How do we make sure that the best comes out of it and not the worst? Any thoughts?
I think the first thing that comes to mind is some of the job matching platforms are starting to use AI in terms of I think building candidate profiles, and in terms of suggesting relevant job matches, and potentially in recruiter screening processes. So that's the first one that comes to mind for me. What about anything else, Mike?
I think that's the only space. I mean, keep in mind, we did most of the data collection for the study was wrapped up over a year ago, wasn't it? I think we did most of the kind of raw gathering in 2023. So that was the thing I was thinking. I think both some of the interventions that are in the study, but there's a whole wider body of work happening within the Job Tech Alliance, which overlaps with MSD sometimes. There's been a webinar even on that topic. So I think that's where we're seeing maybe active experimentation. There's also, I think, quite a few interventions in the study, many of them in Eastern Europe and the Western Balkans, that are really looking at ICT services, business process outsourcing. And although, I mean, I think some of that, it wasn't in the interventions that I can remember, but I do think as a sector to think about, especially when you're operating in those kind of spaces, I think there's significant potential for digital remote work, but on the one hand, but on the other hand, that question of how is that opportunity being amplified or threatened with the kind of new wave of large language models, which can do certain tasks like quite well. So yeah, I think we got to be engaging with it and thinking about it, although it wasn't a huge focus of the interventions in this study. But it's an important question.
Thank you. We have run out of time, so I won't be able to address the last two questions, but thank you everyone who posted questions and who contributed the feedback in the chat. Really appreciate it. But most of all, thank you, Mike and Justin, for really succinct, clear and powerful presentation. And I hope everyone's gone away feeling very empowered with this new resource and what they can do with it. And but yeah, look forward to getting your feedback. Please share the links that Isabel will send you with your colleagues. Please give us your feedback on the link on the form that is in the chat, and have a great day. Justin and Mike, many thanks.
Thank you, Mike. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to share. Much appreciated.